When Arthur Vance purchased the heavy, solidified lump of mud and corrosion from an estate sale in Normandy, he had no idea he was holding the key to a 70-year-old mystery. To the untrained eye, the object looked like nothing more than a piece of industrial debris or a broken fence post that had been buried in a swamp for decades. However, Arthur's experience as a specialist in World War II relic restoration told him otherwise. The weight was distinct, and the faint outline of a trigger guard protruding from the hardened clay suggested that beneath the layers of time lay a rifle, likely an American M1 Garand. He bought it for a negligible amount, expecting to spend weeks simply stabilizing the metal, with the ultimate goal of perhaps recovering a display piece for a local museum. He did not know that this specific rifle had not been dropped in the mud by accident. It had been buried with purpose. Arthur began the process in his workshop, a converted garage filled with electrolysis tanks, sandblasters, and chemical baths. The first step was the most tedious, removing the outer shell of concrete-like mud without damaging the delicate wood or steel underneath. He used plastic scrapers and warm water, working inch by inch. As the dirt fell away, the form of the rifle became undeniable. It was indeed a Garand, the workhorse of the American infantry. But the condition was surprisingly erratic. The metal parts exposed to the air were heavily pitted, but the sections that had been encased in the dense clay were remarkably well preserved, as if the mud had acted as an anaerobic seal. The smell of the workshop filled with the scent of wet earth and ancient iron, a smell Arthur associated with the ghosts of the past. Hey everyone, we are taking a quick second here because we are incredibly close to hitting a huge milestone. We are just a few subscribers away from hitting 10 zero-hour members of this history-loving community. If you are enjoying this restoration and the mystery unfolding, please smash that subscribe button right now to help us cross the finish line. Also, if you want to support these complex restoration projects directly, check out the Super Thanks feature below. It helps us buy the chemicals and tools needed to save history. And I have a question for you all. Drop a comment down below telling us where you're watching from. I want to see how many different countries are represented in our comment section today. Now, let's get back to this rifle, because things are about to get strange. After 3 days of careful cleaning, Arthur reached the critical stage of disassembly. The rifle was still seized with rust, requiring him to submerge the entire action in penetrating oil for 48 hours. When he finally returned to the bench, he applied gentle heat to the screws and fasteners. The goal was to separate the metal receiver from the wooden stock. This was always the most nerve-wracking moment. The wood of 1940s rifles often rotted from the inside out, and one wrong move could crumble the stock into dust. He worked the trigger housing group free with a soft mallet, hearing the satisfying click of the metal releasing its grip. He slowly lifted the barrel and receiver assembly out of the wooden stock. The wood was dark, stained by oil and age, but intact. Arthur turned the stock over to inspect the bedding area, the channel where the barrel rests. Usually this area is smooth, perhaps marked with a factory inspector's stamp or just accumulated grease. But as he wiped away a layer of black sludge with a rag, he froze. The wood underneath the barrel wasn't smooth. It had been aggressively and deeply carved with a knife. He grabbed a bright inspection light and a magnifying lens to examine the markings. They were not factory stamps. The cuts were jagged and erratic, clearly made in a hurry by a soldier in the field. The engraving was deep, cutting through the finish and into the raw walnut. It wasn't a name which was common for soldiers to carve, but a series of alphanumerics and a distinct symbol. The first line read, Archer 4, followed by a string of 6 numbers, 49, 23, 11. Below that was a second string, 06, 55, 08. And beneath the numbers was a crude drawing of a double-headed eagle holding a key. Arthur sat back on his stool, his heart rate accelerating. This wasn't just trench art. The Archer 4 designation didn't match standard infantry unit codes he was familiar with. The numbers looked suspiciously like coordinates, but they were incomplete or coded. The double-headed eagle was even more baffling. It was imagery often associated with European heraldry, or specifically high-ranking German or Austrian crests, yet this was carved into an American rifle. The placement of the carving, inside the stock, under the barrel, meant it was never intended to be seen unless the rifle was disassembled. This was a message meant to be hidden from everyone, perhaps even the soldier's own commanding officers. He realized the cleaning process had to change immediately. This was no longer just a restoration, it was forensic evidence. He stopped using abrasive brushes and switched to cotton swabs and archival-grade solvents to preserve the integrity of the carvings. He carefully photographed the wood under macro lenses, adjusting the contrast to make the faded cuts stand out against the dark grain. As he cleaned further down the stock, near the butt plate, he found another anomaly. The trapdoor in the butt plate, usually used to store a cleaning kit, was fused, shut with rust. However, shaking the stock produced a dull, heavy thud. Something inside was loose, but it didn't sound like the metallic rattle of a cleaning rod. It sounded like a solid, dense object sliding against the wood. Arthur knew he had to open the trapdoor without destroying the history it protected. He applied a precise mixture of heat and freezing spray to the screw, hoping to break the bond of the corrosion. After an hour of painstaking work, the screw turned. He flipped the trapdoor open. Inside, there was no cleaning kit. Instead, jammed tightly into the cavity was a small, cylindrical brass tube, capped at both ends, the kind used for dispatch messages or carrying spare firing pins. But this tube was sealed with red wax. The rifle was a dead drop. A soldier, 70 years ago, had carved coordinates into the wood and hidden a sealed container in the stock, then presumably lost the rifle or died before he could retrieve it. The mud had sealed it in a time capsule. Arthur held the brass tube in his gloved hand. It was heavy for its size. He was holding the breath of a man from 1944, a secret that had survived the war, the elements, and time itself. He placed the tube on the workbench, picked up a small scalpel, and prepared to break the wax seal, knowing that whatever was inside would explain why a soldier felt the need to deface his weapon with secret codes in the middle of a war zone. The restoration project had just ended. The investigation had begun. Arthur's hands were steady, but his pulse hammered in his ears as the scalpel blade met the red wax seal of the brass tube. The wax, brittle with age, cracked with a sharp snap, crumbling into crimson dust on the white paper towel he had laid out. Beneath the wax, the brass cap was threaded. He gripped the tube with a vise lined with soft leather to prevent crushing the soft metal and used a pair of non-marring pliers to twist the cap. It resisted at first, the threads seized by 70 years of oxidation, but with a sharp intake of breath and a firm torque, the seal broke. The cap unscrewed with a gritty metallic screech, releasing a puff of stale, trapped air, the atmosphere of 1944 escaping into the modern room. He tipped the tube upside down. Nothing fell out initially. The contents had expanded slightly or adhered to the brass walls. Using a long, thin pair of tweezers, Arthur reached inside, feeling for the edge of whatever was hidden within. He clamped down on a fibrous material and pulled gently. A tight roll of onion skin paper, yellowed and fragile, slid out. Following it, with a heavier clunk, a small, dark object fell onto the bench. It was a key. Arthur picked up the key first. It was not a standard door key or a padlock key. It was an intricate, skeleton-style key made of blackened iron, featuring a complex bit pattern that looked more suited to a medieval dungeon or a high-security bank deposit box from the turn of the century than a World War II battlefield. The bow of the key, the part held by the fingers, bore the exact same engraving he had found inside the rifle's stock, the double-headed eagle. However, here the detail was much finer. Under the magnifying glass, the eagle was clutching not just a key, but a lightning bolt in its other talon. This specific iconography was obscure, hinting at a specific looting unit or a specialized transport division of the opposing forces. The key was heavy, cold, and clearly the physical component of the mystery, while the coordinates in the stock were the locational component. He turned his attention to the paper. It was rolled so tightly that unrolling it risked shattering the fibers. Arthur moved it to a humidification chamber, a simple plastic box with damp sponges, to reintroduce moisture to the paper fibers, allowing them to relax. He waited an agonizing hour, pacing his workshop, looking back at the disassembled Garand. The rifle was no longer just a piece of rusted steel. It was a courier case. The soldier who carried it had likely discarded the weapon not because it jammed, but to hide the evidence inside it, or perhaps he had fallen while protecting it. When the paper was pliable enough, Arthur flattened it under a pane of glass. The writing was in graphite pencil, smudged but legible. It was a hurried field report written in English, but the handwriting was erratic, suggestive of a man writing under extreme duress or while injured. The header read, "Contact lost, Archer 4." The text detailed the interception of a convoy labeled Operation Werfen, a retreat movement of assets from Paris to the German border. The soldier, identifying himself only as Sarge H., described how his unit had ambushed the truck, expecting munitions, but instead found crates marked with the Austrian eagle. The crates did not contain weapons. They contained the amber room panels and gold reserves. Arthur froze. The amber room was one of the most famous lost treasures of history, a chamber of amber panels stolen by the Nazis and never recovered. If this note was authentic, this soldier had found a fragment of it, or something of equal value, in the chaotic final days of the war. The note continued, darker in tone. It claimed that their own commanding officer, a man referred to as Captain V, had turned on the squad to claim the gold for himself. V had executed the other men. Sergeant H was the only survivor, fleeing into the woods with the key to the main lockbox and the location of the truck, which he had disabled and hidden. The coordinates carved into the rifle stock were not just numbers. They were the resting place of the betrayed unit and the stolen fortune. The note ended with a chilling instruction. If found, trust no uniform. Go to the vault. The key opens the heavy box. Burn this. The soldier had failed to burn the note, choosing instead to hide it in the rifle, perhaps hoping to retrieve it later or ensuring that if his body was found, the truth might eventually be discovered by the right person. Arthur looked back at the rifle receiver. He needed to identify Sergeant H. He returned to the electrolysis tank where the main receiver had been bubbling for hours. He pulled the steel out, washing off the black sludge of converted rust. The metal was pitted, but the heel of the receiver was clean enough to read the stamps. U.S. Rifle Cal, 30 M1 Springfield Armory. Below that was the serial number, 38-214. He immediately went to his computer, logging into the National Archives database and various WWII serial number trackers. He traced the manufacturing date to late 1944. Then, he cross-referenced the serial number with unit issuance logs, a difficult task as records were often incomplete. However, he got a hit on a digitized missing in action report from the 101st Airborne Division, operating near the French-German border in 1945. The rifle was issued to a Sergeant Henry Silas, listed as MIA on January 14, 1945. The report stated his patrol was lost to enemy artillery fire. ICE, a generic explanation often used when no bodies were recovered. The note in the tube told a different story. They weren't killed by artillery. They were murdered by their captain for gold. Arthur pulled up a satellite map of the region where he had bought the rifle. The seller had said it was found in a drainage ditch near the town of Haguenau. Arthur took the coordinates carved into the stock, 49, 23, 11N, 06, 55, 08, E, and punched them into the mapping software. The pin dropped not in Haguenau, but 40 miles east, deep in the dense, protected forests of the Saarland region, just across the German border. The satellite view showed nothing but a canopy of thick green trees and the faint outline of what looked like an old logging road that dead-ended into a steep hillside. The topography was rugged. The coordinates pointed to the base of a ravine, a place likely untouched by modern development due to the difficult terrain. If the truck had been disabled and hidden there in 1945, and if the area had been overgrown, it was entirely possible the wreckage was still there, swallowed by the forest. The Captain V mentioned in the note might never have been able to return for it, or perhaps he died before he could retrieve his prize. Arthur looked at the blackened key, the fragile paper, and the resurrected rifle. He wasn't just a restorer anymore. He was the executor of Sergeant Henry Silas's last will. He couldn't leave this in the workshop. The local authorities would bury it in bureaucracy. Or worse, the site would be looted if news got out. He had to verify the find himself. He began packing his field gear, metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, climbing ropes, and the restored receiver of the M1 Garand, not to fire, but as a talisman to return to the site of the betrayal. He was going to the coordinates. He was going to find the ghost convoy. Arthur packed his Land Rover with a methodical precision that mirrored his restoration work. In the back, alongside the ground-penetrating radar unit and a high-frequency metal detector, sat the disassembled stock of the M1 Garand, the brass tube, and the blackened iron key. He felt a strange compulsion to bring the rifle parts with him, as if the weapon were a divining rod that needed to be returned to its point of origin to close the circuit. The drive from his workshop in Normandy to the German border was a long, solitary journey through the rolling French countryside, transitioning from the open fields of the west to the denser, craggy terrain of the Alsace-Lorraine region. As he crossed the invisible border into the Saarland, the weather turned. Heavy slate-gray clouds obscured the sun, casting a premature twilight over the endless canopy of fir and spruce trees. The GPS guided him off the Autobahn and onto a series of narrowing paved roads, which eventually dissolved into a gravel logging track. The forest here was ancient and foreboding, a place where the scars of the 20th century had been swallowed by moss and root systems, the coordinates carved into the rifle stock, 49, 23, 11N, 06, 55, 08, E, pointed to a location that was technically a nature reserve, an area left largely untouched since the war due to the risk of unexploded ordnance. Arthur parked his vehicle at the end of the drivable track, checking his equipment one last time. He strapped on a heavy backpack, holstered a bear spray canister, more for feral dogs or boars than bears, and took the metal detector in hand. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the bed of pine needles. The hike to the precise location was grueling. The terrain sloped sharply downward into a ravine that didn't appear on modern tourist maps. It was a jagged scar in the earth, likely formed by a mix of natural erosion and the violent artillery bombardments of 1945. As Arthur descended, the air grew cooler and damper. He swept the metal detector in wide arcs, listening to the threshold hum in his headphones. For the first hour, he found nothing but the ubiquitous detritus of war. shrapnel fragments, spent shell casings, and a rusted canteen cup. These were the surface echoes of the conflict, the common trash of an army on the move. But he was looking for something massive, something that had been hidden, not dropped. When he reached the bottom of the ravine, the GPS indicated he was within 10 meters of the target. He looked around. The area was a dense tangle of brambles and fallen trees, piled up against the side of a steep limestone cliff face. To a casual hiker, it looked like a natural rockfall. But Arthur's eye, trained to spot the difference between natural decay and man-made structures, noticed the irregularity. The mound of earth and stone against the cliff was too uniform in its chaotic arrangement. It looked like a blast site where explosives had been used to intentionally bring the cliffside down. He calibrated the ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and began to push the cart-like device over the uneven ground in front of the rockfall. The screen displayed a chaotic mess of noise, roots and rocks, until he passed over the center of the mound. The display shifted instantly. A hard, flat return appeared on the screen, a massive rectangular anomaly buried 6 feet beneath the surface debris. It was too large to be a bomb and too geometric to be a rock. It was metal, and it was hollow. Arthur abandoned the electronics and grabbed his folding and trenching tool. He began to dig at the base of the rockfall, attacking the loose soil and scree. It was backbreaking work. The soil was a mixture of clay and sharp stones. After 2 hours of digging, his shovel struck something that didn't chip or thud. It rang. A dull, metallic clang echoed in the ravine. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the dirt with his gloved hands. Beneath the soil lay the mangled, rusted curve of a fender. He cleared more space, revealing a headlight housing. It wasn't American. The shape was distinctively angular. It was the front left fender of an Opel Blitz, the primary cargo truck of the German Wehrmacht. The truck had been driven into a natural alcove or cave, and then the entrance had been blown shut, burying the vehicle under tons of rock. Over 70 years, the tires had rotted and the frame had settled, but the tomb remained intact. Arthur had found the ghost convoy. He needed to access the cargo bed. The cab was crushed flat by the rockfall, a grim sight that made him pause, wondering if the driver was still inside. He respectfully moved his excavation toward the rear of the vehicle, which seemed to have been shielded by the deeper recess of the cave. He worked carefully, destabilizing the rocks above him as little as possible. Finally, he cleared a crawl space alongside the truck's chassis, squeezing his body through the gap between the rusted metal and the limestone wall. He shone his tactical light into the darkness of the truck's rear cavity. The canvas cover of the truck had long since disintegrated, leaving only the skeletal metal hoops. Inside the bed, piled haphazardly as if thrown in a panic, were 6 large wooden crates. They were rotting, the wood soft and pulpy, held together only by their iron banding. But near the front of the bed, separated from the wooden crates, sat a different object. It was a heavy, iron-bound chest, relatively small but clearly built for high-value transport. On the lid, barely visible through the layer of dust, was the faint, embossed outline of the double-headed eagle, the same symbol carved into the rifle stock and the key. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. This was the heavy box mentioned in Sergeant Silas's note. He maneuvered himself into the cramped space, the air thick with the smell of rust and enclosed dampness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the blackened iron key. His hand trembled slightly. This was the moment of truth. If the key didn't fit, the mystery would remain locked in iron. If it did, he would be opening a door to 1945. He brushed the dirt from the keyhole. It was a complex lever lock mechanism. He inserted the key. It slid in with a gritty resistance, pushing past 70 years of grime. He felt the bit of the key engage with the tumblers. He applied pressure, turning it clockwise. There was a moment of resistance, a feeling that the metal might shear off, and then a loud, sharp clack. The internal bolt retracted. Arthur placed both hands on the heavy iron lid and heaved it upward. The hinges groaned, screaming against the rust, but the lid opened. He shone his light inside. The beam hit a reflective surface, sending a golden shimmer dancing across the cave walls. The chest was not filled with coins or loose jewelry. It contained a set of perfectly stacked, rectangular bars wrapped in oilcloth that had partially rotted away. He reached in and pulled the cloth back. The unmistakable buttery yellow luster of pure gold shone back at him. But nestling next to the gold was something far more breathtaking. A panel, roughly 2 feet square, seemingly made of glowing fire. It was amber, intricately carved, glowing with a deep orange and honey hue. It was a mosaic piece of immense beauty. He was looking at a piece of the amber room. The soldier's note was true. This wasn't just bullion. This was one of the greatest lost art treasures in human history. But as he stared at the fortune, his light caught something else at the bottom of the box, a leather satchel preserved by the dryness of the sealed chest. It was stamped with the personal insignia of a U.S. Army captain. It was the property of Captain V. Arthur realized the captain hadn't just stolen the gold. He had used this box to stash his own personal incriminating documents, believing he would come back for it all. Arthur reached for the satchel, but a sound from outside the cave froze him. It was the unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine approaching on the logging road above. A heavy diesel engine, and then the slamming of doors. Arthur killed his light, plunging himself into total darkness next to the glowing gold. He was miles from civilization, alone in a hole in the ground, and someone else had just arrived at the coordinates. Arthur pressed his back against the cold, damp limestone of the cave wall, his breath held tight in his chest. The silence of the ravine was shattered by the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on loose gravel, descending the slope with practiced speed. There were at least 3 men, moving not with the casual gait of hikers, but with the coordinated precision of a tactical unit. Beams of high-intensity LED light sliced through the twilight outside, sweeping across the brush and focusing intently on the pile of fresh earth Arthur had excavated. He had been careless. In his excitement to uncover the past, he had forgotten to watch his back in the present. He realized with a sickening jolt that the electronic pings he had sent out, searching the serial number, accessing the archives, might have triggered a digital tripwire. The Captain V, mentioned in the soldier's note, was likely not just a ghost, but the patriarch of a legacy that was still very much alive and protecting its secrets. Inside the cramped crawl space behind the Opal Blitz, Arthur made a split-second decision. He could not save the gold. The chest was too heavy, and the amber room panel was too fragile to move quickly. The treasure would have to remain, but the truth could not. He grabbed the leather satchel belonging to Captain V, shoving it deep inside his jacket and zipping it tight against his chest. He also pocketed the blackened iron key. Without it, the chest would be difficult to open without destroying the contents, buying him a margin of time. He retreated deeper into the shadow of the truck's rusted chassis, squeezing himself into a gap between the rear axle and the cave wall, becoming one with the darkness just as the first silhouette appeared at the opening he had cleared. The intruder was a towering figure, dressed in dark, unbranded tactical gear, holding a suppressed carbine. The weapon confirmed Arthur's worst fears. These were not law enforcement. They were cleaners. The man signaled behind him, and 2 others slid into the excavation pit. They moved directly to the hole Arthur had dug, their lights cutting into the gloom of the cave. Arthur watched through the spokes of the rusted wheel as the lead man shone his light on the iron chest. He saw the gloved hand brush away the dust, revealing the double-headed eagle. The man stiffened, clearly recognizing the symbol. He reached for a radio on his vest, tapping it twice, a signal of confirmation. Arthur knew he had seconds before they swept the rest of the cave and found him. He needed a distraction, something violent and immediate. His hand drifted to his belt, unclipping the canister of bear spray he had brought for wildlife. It was a high-pressure canister designed to stop a charging grizzly. In the confined, unventilated space of the cave, it would be devastating. He waited until 2 of the men were kneeling by the chest, their heads close together as they inspected the lock. The 3rd man was standing guard near the entrance, blocking the only exit. Arthur needed to move the guard. He picked up a loose stone from the cave floor and tossed it hard toward the far corner of the cave, away from the truck. The sound of the rock clattering against the wall was sharp and echoing. The guard spun around, aiming his weapon at the noise. "Clear right," he gestured, stepping deeper into the cave to investigate. This was the opening. Arthur pulled the safety pin from the canister. He rolled out from under the truck, not to run, but to attack. He aimed the nozzle at the 2 kneeling men and unleashed a thick, orange cloud of capsaicin fog. The effect was instantaneous. The chemicals hit the men in the face, blinding them and seizing their lungs. They collapsed backward, coughing violently, their tactical discipline shattering into primal panic. The guard turned back, but the cloud was already expanding, filling the small cave. Arthur didn't wait to see if the guard was incapacitated. He scrambled over the hood of the crushed truck, using the vehicle as a bridge to bypass the writhing figures on the ground. He burst out of the cave entrance, his own eyes stinging from the periphery of the spray, gasping for the fresh, cold forest air. He didn't head for the logging road. That was a kill zone. His Land Rover would be boxed in, monitored, or disabled. Instead, he threw himself into the dense, thorny undergrowth of the ravine, scrambling up the steep, rocky slope opposite the road. He moved on hands and knees, clawing at roots and wet earth, driven by pure adrenaline. Behind him, he heard shouting, angry, guttural commands in a language that sounded Eastern European, mixed with the retching sounds of men incapacitated by the gas. He had bought himself minutes, maybe less. Arthur reached the ridgeline and didn't stop. He plunged into the deep forest, moving perpendicular to the road, aiming for the denser, older growth where vehicles couldn't follow. The night had fully set in, the trees reducing visibility to 0. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, finally collapsing behind the trunk of a massive fallen oak tree. He lay there in the moss, listening. Far below, he heard the revving of engines and the slamming of doors. They were spreading out. They would have thermal optics. He couldn't stay still for long. But first, he needed to know what he was dying for. He unzipped his jacket and pulled out the leather satchel. He shielded his small tactical light with his body, creating a tiny cup of illumination. The leather was cracked, but the contents were dry. Inside was a leather-bound ledger and a bundle of letters. He opened the ledger. It wasn't just a list of stolen goods, it was a payroll. The entries dated back to 1945, detailing bribes paid to border guards, falsified transport logs, and the names of soldiers silenced. But the name at the top of the ledger froze Arthur's blood. Captain Victor Vance. The name stared up at him, mocking him. V wasn't a stranger. Victor Vance was Arthur's own great-uncle, the black sheep of the family who had supposedly died a hero in the war, leaving behind a legacy of honor that Arthur had grown up revering. The man he was hunting, the war criminal who had murdered his own men for gold, was his own blood. Arthur flipped to the letters. They were recent, impossibly recent. Dated from the 1980s and 90s, they were correspondence between Victor, who had faked his death, and a shadowy holding company based in Zurich. The letters outlined the liquidation of Asset B, the bearer bonds, to fund a massive legitimate business empire, while Asset A, the amber room and gold, remained in the Saarland vault as an emergency reserve. The final letter was dated just 3 weeks ago, addressed to the trustee. It read, "The location is compromised. The rifle has surfaced. Eliminate the finder. Secure the vault." Arthur realized the magnitude of the trap he had walked into. He hadn't just found a treasure. He had stumbled into the middle of a family succession crisis. The people hunting him weren't just mercenaries. They were employees of a company built on stolen blood money, money that technically belonged to his own family line, but was controlled by a criminal faction. The trustee, mentioned in the letter, was likely the current head of this empire, protecting the secret that their fortune was built on treason. He stuffed the ledger back into the satchel. He couldn't go to the police. The police were likely on the payroll of a corporation powerful enough to hide a Nazi treasure for 70 years. He was alone in the German woods, hunted by his own family's dark legacy, holding the proof that would destroy them. He needed a weapon, and he needed a way out. He remembered the rifle receiver he had left in the Land Rover, useless now, but he still had the knowledge of the terrain. He checked his GPS. The ravine connected to an old mesmerizing network of WWII bunkers and tunnels that ran under the border, marked on his historical maps, but forgotten by modern roads. It was a labyrinth. If he could reach the bunker entrance 3 miles east, he could disappear underground where their thermal drones couldn't see him. He tightened his boots, checked his compass, and began to move, not as a restorer, but as a soldier in a war that hadn't ended in 1945. The forest floor was a treacherous labyrinth of rotted logs and concealed pitfalls, the ground uneven from the scars of century-old artillery bombardments. Arthur moved with a desperate, animalistic urgency, his breath tearing at his throat in ragged gasps. Above the canopy, the distinct, high-pitched whine of a drone grew louder, cutting through the wind. It wasn't a hobbyist's toy. It was a military-grade thermal surveillance unit hunting for his heat signature against the cold background of the woods. Arthur knew he couldn't outrun a flying camera. He spotted a depression in the earth, a shallow flooded crater left by a shell explosion from a war long ended. Without hesitation, he slid into the muck, the freezing sludge soaking instantly through his clothes. He grabbed handfuls of the wet, clay-heavy earth and smeared it over his face, neck, and jacket, trying to mask his thermal outline with the cold mud. He pressed himself flat against the crater's lip, motionless, as the drone hovered directly overhead, the electronic eye whirred, its lens swiveling, scanning the darkness. The downwash from its rotors stirred the dead leaves around his hiding spot. For a terrifying 10 seconds, it lingered, a mechanical vulture waiting for a twitch or a breath. Then, satisfied that the patch of forest was empty, it banked sharply to the west and sped off. Arthur exhaled, the sound trembling in the silence. He was invisible for the moment, but the net was tightening. The mercenaries would be vectoring in on his last known location, sweeping the woods in a grid pattern. He hauled himself out of the mud, shivering violently, the adrenaline beginning to crash into hypothermia. He checked his compass. The WWII bunker network lay 2 miles east, embedded in a ridge of limestone that ran along the border. He moved slower now, prioritizing stealth over speed. The terrain here was known as a Zone Rouge, an area so devastated by the First World War that it had never been fully reclaimed. Rusted coils of barbed wire, thick as a man's thumb, snaked through the undergrowth like iron vines, tearing at his trousers. Unexploded shells sat half buried in the roots of trees, silent sentinels of death that demanded careful footing. After an hour of grueling navigation, the ridge loomed out of the darkness, a dark gray mass against the black sky. Arthur scanned the rock face until he saw it, the angular, unnatural geometry of a concrete pillbox, overgrown with ivy and moss. It was part of the Siegfried Line defenses, a relic of the Second World War built on top of older fortifications. The main firing slit was too narrow to enter, but Arthur knew these structures often had rear access tunnels for troop movements. He scrambled up the scree slope, slipping on loose shale until he found the steel blast door set into the hillside. It was rusted shut, welded by time and oxidation. He dropped his pack and retrieved a small pry bar he used for leverage in the field. He wedged it into the seam of the door and heaved with everything he had left. The metal groaned, flakes of rust raining down, but it didn't budge. He cursed silently, looking back down the slope. Through the trees, he saw the bobbing beams of flashlights. They were close, less than half a mile away. He adjusted his grip, finding a leverage point near the rusted hinges, and threw his entire body weight against the bar. With a screech that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night, one hinge snapped. The heavy door sagged, creating a gap just wide enough for a human body. Arthur squeezed through, the jagged metal scraping his back, and tumbled into the damp, stale air of the bunker. Inside, the silence was oppressive. The air tasted of wet concrete and ancient dust. He clicked on his tactical light, keeping the beam low. He was in a long, concrete corridor, the walls dripping with condensation. Old German graffiti, faded and ghostly, marked the walls, names of soldiers who had manned this post in 1944, waiting for an Allied advance that bypassed them. Arthur was now underground, hidden from the thermal drones, but he had trapped himself in a tomb. He needed to find an exit that led to the other side of the ridge, into the next valley where he could disappear into the civilian population. He moved deeper into the complex, his footsteps echoing softly. The complex was vast, a subterranean city of ammunition storage rooms, sleeping quarters, and connecting tunnels. As he walked, he pulled the leather satchel tight against his chest. He needed to understand the enemy. He found a dry corner in what used to be a radio room and sat down for a brief moment to examine the ledger again. He flipped past the 1940s entries to the modern section. The handwriting had changed, becoming precise and corporate. The entries detailed a network of shell companies used to launder the assets. One name appeared repeatedly: Argentum Holdings. It was a firm Arthur recognized, a massive, legitimate logistics conglomerate based in Zurich, known for shipping fine art and high-value antiques. The realization made him nauseous. The company he had occasionally bid against in high-end auctions, the company that sponsored museum exhibits, was the modern face of Captain Victor Vance's stolen fortune. They weren't just a criminal gang, they were a pillar of the industry. And the trustee leading them wasn't just a faceless executive. A loose photo tucked into the back of the ledger showed a man in a tuxedo shaking hands with politicians. Arthur recognized him instantly. It was Julian Vance, his own second cousin, the successful branch of the family that Arthur had always envied for their wealth and connections. The betrayal was total. His cousin Julian was the one hunting him. Julian knew the history, knew the source of the family wealth, and had ordered the hit to protect the secret. The cleaners outside were likely Argentum's private security contractors, a force with global reach. Arthur wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting to tear down his own family's empire. A deep, metallic clang reverberated through the tunnel system, coming from the entrance he had just forced open. The sound carried for miles in the concrete acoustic chamber. They had found the broken hinge. They were inside. Arthur scrambled to his feet, panic flaring. He couldn't go back. He had to go forward, deeper into the dark. He consulted the mental map of the bunker layouts he had studied years ago. These fortifications often had emergency escape shafts, vertical ladders leading to surface pillboxes on the crest of the ridge. It was a desperate climb, but it was the only way out. He began to run, the sound of his boots loud in the corridor. Behind him, he heard the distinct, rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire. They were firing blindly down the hallway to suppress him, or perhaps testing the acoustics. Bullets chipped the concrete ceiling 50 yards behind him, the ricochets singing like angry hornets. He reached a junction and turned left, sprinting towards the ventilation sector. He found the ladder, a rusted iron skeleton clinging to a wet shaft that disappeared into the gloom above. He holstered his light to keep his hands free and began to climb. The rungs were slick with slime and the metal was pitted. Each step was a gamble. If a rung snapped, he would fall 40 feet to the concrete floor. He climbed with a frantic rhythm, his breath echoing in the narrow tube. Below him, beams of light cut into the hallway he had just left. Voices shouted commands. They had reached the ladder base. Arthur scrambled faster, his muscles burning. He reached the top, his hand hitting a heavy steel hatch. He pushed up. It was locked from the outside. He was trapped in the vertical coffin. He slammed his shoulder against it, shouting in frustration, but the mechanism was seized. Below, the first mercenary started climbing the ladder, the metal groaning under the added weight. Arthur looked around the top of the shaft in desperation. There was no lever, no wheel. But there was a gap in the concrete where the mechanism entered the wall. He jammed the barrel of the M1 Garand receiver, the piece of steel he had carried all this way, into the gap and used it as a lever. The hardened 1940s steel bit into the rusted locking bar. He pulled down with a primal scream of effort. With a grinding crunch, the lock sheared. Arthur threw the hatch open and pulled himself up into the night air. He was on the crest of the ridge, the wind howling around him. He didn't stop to close the hatch. He rolled onto the grass and scrambled away from the opening just as a stream of bullets erupted from the shaft, sparking against the rim. He was out, but he was exposed on the skyline, and the hunt was far from over. Arthur scrambled down the northern face of the ridge, his body a mass of bruises and exhaustion, sliding uncontrollably on the loose shale. The descent was perilous, a controlled fall through biting thorns and icy mud, but it put the solid mass of the mountain between him and the mercenaries emerging from the bunker shaft. Below him, through the thinning tree line, the amber glow of streetlights from a sleepy border village offered a beacon of civilization. He wasn't just running towards safety, he was running toward a signal. He checked his phone. For the first time in hours, a single bar of service flickered on the screen. The ridge had unblocked the line of sight to the cell towers in the valley. He didn't stop running. He knew that the mercenaries, led by the ruthless precision of Argentum Holdings, would anticipate his move. They would have vehicles moving to intercept him on the valley roads before he could reach the local police station. He needed to weaponize the truth before they could silence him. Stumbling into the cover of an old stone barn on the outskirts of the village, Arthur collapsed against a hay bale, his hands shaking violently as he pulled the leather satchel from his jacket. He didn't dial 911. That would be too slow, and local police might be intercepted. Instead, he opened his camera app. In the dim light of the barn, he snapped high-resolution photos of the most damning pages of the ledger, the payrolls for the hitmen, the bribes to customs officials, and the direct correspondence signed by Julian Vance ordering the cleaning of the site. He then photographed the soldier's suicide note and the map coordinates. He opened his email and attached the files. He added 3 recipients, a contact at the FBI art crime team he had worked with years ago, a relentless investigative journalist at the New York Times, and a general tip line for Interpol. He watched the progress bar inch forward, 10%, 40%, 70%. Outside, the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the hunting party. They had cut off the road. The upload hit 100%, sent. The digital bullet had been fired. Seconds later, the barn doors were kicked open. 3 tactical lights blinded him. Arthur didn't run. He sat calmly on the hay bale, the disassembled receiver of the M1 Garand resting on his lap like a sacred relic. The lead mercenary raised his weapon, ready to end the chase, but Arthur simply held up his phone, screen facing out. He tapped the sent folder. The mercenary paused, his earpiece buzzing with frantic chatter from their command center. The data had already triggered alerts in Julian Vance's monitoring systems in Zurich. The secret was out. Killing Arthur now wouldn't bury the truth. It would only turn a financial crimes investigation into a murder investigation. The standoff lasted an agonizing minute. The mercenary lowered his rifle, cursing into his radio. The element of surprise and secrecy, their only real armor, was gone. In the distance, the wailing of sirens began to echo through the valley. The explosion in the bunker and the earlier gunfire had not gone unnoticed by the border patrol. The mercenaries looked at each other, made a calculation, and retreated into the night, abandoning the site to save themselves before the authorities arrived. Arthur remained in the barn, clutching the rifle parts and the ledger, listening as the sirens grew louder, signaling the end of the war that Sergeant Henry Silas had started 70 years ago. The aftermath was a media firestorm that rocked the art and financial worlds. The evidence provided by Arthur Vance was irrefutable. Interpol agents, guided by Arthur's coordinates, descended on the ravine in the Saarland. They excavated the cave, recovering not only the gold bullion, valued at over $40 million, but the centerpiece of the find, the authentic amber room mosaic panel. It was hailed as the discovery of the century. The chest also contained the records that unraveled the Vance family's dark history. Julian Vance was arrested in Zurich as he attempted to board a private jet, charged with racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The Argentum Holdings empire collapsed overnight. Arthur, however, stayed away from the press conferences and the flashing cameras. He declined the talk show invitations. He had one final task to complete. 3 months later, Arthur stood in his quiet, sunlit workshop. On the workbench lay the M1 Garand. It was no longer a lump of mud or a collection of rusted parts. It was finished. He had not over-restored it. He left the scars of battle on the wood and the pitting on the receiver, honoring its history. But the mechanism was clean, oiled, and functional. The walnut stock, where the coordinates had been carved, was preserved with museum-grade wax, the desperate knife marks of Sergeant Silas now highlighted as a permanent memorial. Arthur picked up the rifle. It was heavy, cold, and beautiful. He didn't mount it on a wall or sell it to a collector for the 6-figure sum he had been offered. He packed it into a hard-shell case and drove to a small military cemetery in Normandy. He walked to a white cross that stood among thousands, reading the name he had found in the archives, Sergeant Henry Silas, 101st Airborne. Missing in action, 1945. The Army had eventually found Silas's remains in the woods years after the war, but the story of his heroism and betrayal had been lost, until now. Arthur couldn't leave the rifle at the grave, but he knelt and placed the blackened iron key on top of the headstone. Mission accomplished. "Sergeant," he whispered. "The package is delivered. The line is secure." Arthur returned to his workshop, the door chiming as he entered. He looked at the empty space on the wall where the Garand would have gone. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had started looking for a profit in a piece of scrap metal, but he had ended up restoring the honor of a forgotten soldier and cleansing the rot from his own family name. He turned off the lights, leaving the workshop in the soft gray of twilight, ready for the next piece of rusted history to cross his threshold. The past was never truly dead. It was just waiting to be cleaned.